Welcome everyone, I am Tock Custom and I am in Chicago here with a very good friend of mine. This is Maggie.
Hi, I'm Maggie from Paisley and Glue, and I have been a theatrical costume maker for over 10 years professionally, and I'm also a cosplayer.
Excellent, I'm very happy to be here. And what are we going to be doing in this video?
So today we are going to be learning about continuous lapped plackets, which is a very versatile technique that we often use to make various openings for sleeves and heads and other things like that.
Exactly. So you're going to show a few examples and then we're going to show everyone how to actually execute this technique. So we ready to go?
Yeah, let's do it.
Cool.
So this is a good example of a continuous lap placket in the back of a garment. And so this opens, and once this is unsnapped, this hood, then it will allow the head to pass through. And then once this is all snapped together, since there's no center back seam, it still allows there to be a fairly unobtrusive, low profile closure.
Perfect. So this kind of thing right here, you could do on the cuff of a sleeve or on maybe the waistband of a dress or something like that as well, correct?
Yep, for sure.
Excellent.
So for right now, this is just a scrap piece of fabric. It's 12 by 14. So we have an 8-inch opening, or we will have an 8-inch opening, which means that this strip that we're going to end up binding this off with needs to be twice the length to go off both sides, plus about an inch of seam allowance on each side. And we're going to end up having more than we need, but it's better than too little. So we'll cut it a little bit longer to avoid any problems in the future. So the first thing we need to do before we cut this opening, we need to stay stitch on either side of this line that we've drawn. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to stitch very close to this line, about a scant eighth away. We're going to stitch it scant eighth all the way down, and when we get to the end, it's going to zero out right at this pivot point, pivot, and then stitch all the way back up at another scant eighth.
All right, so now Maggie is just doing a stitch on the right side of that line, about an eighth of an inch seam allowance. And now she's going to make sure that her pivot point is right on the tip of that line. Do a full 180 pivot, and then bring it back, going the other way at a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance on the opposite side of that line.
So with a nice close-up, you can see how I really zeroed that out right to the bottom of my line, pivoted, and then returned back to that 1/8 stitch line at that point. So now we're ready to cut this open. You're going to very carefully cut right along your pencil line.
Just right between those stitches,
right between the stitches, all the way up to, but not cutting through your pivot point. So this can be a little tricky. Okay. So now here is our opening cut open. We're ready to start putting our binding on. So if you look at this, if you open this carefully, you can open this opening basically into a straight line. You just have this extra fabric. So that's kind of what we're going to be doing as we're stitching. And as we get to this point here, this pivot point, we're going to stop and pivot and move all this extra fabric out of the way and then continue going. And that's what we mean by continuous lap placket. It's a continuous stitch line from one end of the placket to the other. We want to, again, stitch as close to the edge as we can. So it's not completely a 1/8, but it's just slightly more than that. So
3/8 of an inch.
Not even, like just under 1/4 of an inch.
Okay.
So if you want to move your needle over to one side to help you with that, you can do that. I will go ahead and do that. Help me get a little bit closer to the edge.
So I notice you're not even pinning this.
I'm not.
Okay, so you probably don't want to, so that you don't get any pleats or anything, right?
Yeah, and because normally you're going to be doing this on the straight of grain for both pieces of fabric, you don't really need to pin it. It's
cool.
Two non-stretchy fabrics. If you were going to do it as stretch fabric, that would be a little bit different of a thing. So I've moved my needle all the way over. That gives me just under 1/4 of an inch. So I'm even going to cheat it over just a little bit more.
So you got like a very fine edge stitch that you're looking for. Got our back stitch, and then we're just going to go all the way through until she gets to the middle, and then we'll show you what to do.
Again, when you start to get towards that middle point, you need to kind of zero out your stitches even closer to that edge. So I'm about 1 inch away now. Okay, so now we're starting to get closer to this point. I'm going to slow down. And as I come to that point, I'm going to bring my needle ever closer to the edge of the fabric. We can see getting a little bit closer.
So you're about half an inch from that corner point,
Yeah,
from that center point?
About a 1/4 inch right now.
Okay.
So at this point, I'm almost at that point. I'm going to start shifting this excess fabric to the other side to get it out of the way of my needle. Lower my presser foot again, and I'm going to manually bring it in to that point.
So now you're in that dead center
I'm
zone.
in the dead center, and I'm again back at that scant 1/8. And now at this point, we're going to shift the excess more, and we're going to bring these two cut edges again into a straight line with each other.
Okay, so you don't even have to pivot because you're just going to keep doing a continuous straight stitch
You're
line.
pivoting the fabric underneath as opposed to
Right.
turning the whole thing. And then...
So the rest of this is just a nice straight stitch all the
Yeah.
way to the edge.
Now you can see I have plenty left over, but you do lose a little bit at that pivot point in the middle. So we can cut this off, but if we had cut it the exact same amount, it probably would have been just a little short. And I have done that many times. Okay, so this is stitched onto the front of our opening. It all looks great. And we're gonna go to the ironing board now and do our next step. So at this point, we're gonna decide how wide we want our binding to be. This is pretty wide, pretty long opening here, and it's in a linen. So we're gonna do more of a 1/2 inch, which is about as much as this, as an 1¼ inch will allow us to do. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna press my fabric so that this seam is nice and flat.
The part at that pivot point, are you pressing that at all right
Yeah,
now?
it's a little hard to do without getting a
Like a big pleat in the
without
middle?
a pleat. Yeah, the whole point is to avoid getting that pleat if you can. I'm clipping very carefully through what's left of my seam allowance in that corner to try to open that up as much as possible. Because this fabric
Oh, I see.
ends up being a little bit bulky, it's a little bit difficult, but that's pretty good. Okay. So now from the back side.
So this is going to be kind of like a rolled hem, basically.
Yeah.
And you decided on doing about a 1/2 inch rolled hem.
I'm going to do about as wide as I can make it, which
Okay.
is more going to be more like 3/8. So I'm going to turn this under, turn that seam allowance in about 1/4 inch and press that down. Okay, so that looks like that at this point. And now we're going to fold the seam allowance of that binding over and press again.
This is on the inside.
This is on the inside. When you get to this pivot point in here, as you fold this down, you just want to catch that seam allowance. You don't want to catch any of this excess folded fabric, but you can see how this is basically a straight open line at this point. Okay, we can kind of see from the front what this is going to look like. I'm going to stitch this in the ditch. You can definitely do it by hand if you'd like to. So I'm going to pin it from the front right through that seam into our folded edge on the back side. And again, right at this pivot point, I'm going to go down through that seam without catching any of this excess and make sure that I'm catching this folded piece in the back. All right, now we're ready to stitch it. Okay, so we're ready to stitch. We're on the outside of our fabric and we're going to stitch in the ditch, which means we're just going to stitch right along that existing stitch line. If your thread color matches really well, you will almost never see that. And I move my needle back to the middle of my presser foot.
All right, so she's just stitching right between those two panels of fabric, right where that seam comes together. And for this, make sure you pull out your pins in advance.
All right, we're coming to that pivot point. So again, come to your point, bring up your foot, shift that excess, and bring your foot back down.
How's it look?
Let's see, looks good. This looks pretty good. Sometimes you'll miss that little pivot point, like you won't quite catch that fold, but this looks like we did pretty well here.
Okay. So if I zoom in, you can see she did an excellent job of just barely catching the inside lining all the way around from top to bottom, including that center point without creating a pleat, which is exactly what you want.
So now we've got our placket formed, but now we need to decide which way we're going to fold it and tack it down. So generally, the nice thing about these plackets is that with a little steam and iron, we're going to fold one side under and create a little
Oh, so you're going to roll it again.
invisible. Yeah, so one side, whichever side you decide, is going to be rolled under, and we're going to press this nice and flat, and that's going to lay on top of this. So the idea is that you're not going to see this seam, and you can always use a couple hooks and eyes or some snaps on the inside to hold that closed. The other thing that's helpful at that point is to do a little V stitch right at our base to keep that placket closed. So I'm going to stitch right from your seam line, not necessarily from the folded edge, because that's extending a little bit over on into our extra fabric here. So I'm going to stitch from here and just take a little triangle out of that, and that's going to keep our placket closed at the bottom.
You're going to trim it afterwards then?
No.
Okay. Okay, so she's just stitching right across that very faint line on that corner on the inside. Okay, so Maggie just did a quick little diagonal stitch to cover the inside of
Our placket.
our placket. Okay. Okay, so now we're at the outside, and she has decided to use, what, the left side?
It still doesn't matter. You can do it either way.
Okay.
So, but you can see how that's keeping the placket much more contained at that point. It really depends on your preference, which side. Normally, if it's going to go on a side seam, I will choose to open the placket going towards the back of the body. So as you're looking at the front of somebody, you're going to see a nice clean line as opposed to
An opening
seeing
that's
that.
very obvious,
Yeah.
right?
So I'm going to sort of just choose to turn this side back. So we're going to go back to the iron and we're going to press this really flat.
Okay.
So we're going to use the iron and lots of steam to get a nice crisp line here. And I'm going to use the clapper on top to really cement that fold. And then before we leave the iron, I'm just going to press this, the little pleat that you get right at the bottom here. Get that to behave. Okay.
Excellent. That looks very clean. Everything is done, everything is stitched, everything is pressed, and it looks terrific. So now Maggie was going to do a top stitch on the pressed edge that's going to go on top of the other side, correct?
Yeah, so that's just going to hold this as a fold. I'm just going to put a quick little stitch right at the top of this seam allowance to keep this fold from becoming unfolded in preparation of however we choose to finish off the top of our project.
Okay, so she just did a top stitch just right at the end of the fabric there. You don't have to go all the way down, and now that...
And that just keeps our placket from becoming unfolded and keeps all that in place.
Cool. So we are done with this project, and like Maggie just said, you could add some hook and eyes or snaps or maybe a cuff at the end or a collar, or if you're doing this in the back of a tunic or maybe the side of a dress or something like that. There's so many applications you can do with this.
Yeah. So going back to this project, we can see again how this is just lined. So there's no binding at the top of it. It's just all folded into itself with a lining. And then this little shirt is a good example of a pretty small, narrow one. I actually didn't even do the little triangle stitch, which I probably should have. But you can see that is inserted into the band.
Yep, and that's just got a
at the
traditional
wrist.
button. And this is just on a Renaissance shirt that's got some cool ruffles and a little bit of that fabulous smocking at the top. And then as a final example, which is actually kind of hard to see because there's so many pleats,
Yeah.
there's a very large continuous lap placket right there.
So yeah, period skirts have openings on the side seams, which then allow you to get into your pocket, which is tied around your waist as a separate piece. So this very long continuous lap placket is allowing me access into my pocket. And it's also finishing off this edge. I've got a built-in petticoat inside the skirt as well. So it's finishing off the edges of both of those skirts at the same time.
Right. And actually the inside of that is lined with a different fabric altogether as well, isn't it? Because you've got
Yeah,
that
so
black...
it's a black taffeta is the petticoat skirt.
Right.
And then this silk dupioni is the fashion fabric.
Perfect. All right, so we are all done with our demonstration of a continuous lap placket, and I want to thank Maggie for having me in her studio. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
Make sure you guys are following Paisley and Glue on YouTube as well as her other platforms. And what can they find on your YouTube channel?
They're going to find a lot more sewing content, a lot of short tutorials like this one, and some longer form project-based videos as well.
Thank you all so much for watching this video. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments. Again, please make sure you're following Paisley and Glue on her channel and social media. Thank you again so much, and thank you all for your support, and thank you for watching. We will see you in our next tutorial.